everyone, and welcome to the July edition of the Economist Intelligence Unit's Global Outlook video. My name is Agathe Demarais, and I'm the Global Forecasting Director at the Economist Intelligence Unit. I'm joined today by Tom Rafferty, our Asia Regional Director based in Beijing, and Nick Marro, our Lead for Global Trade and China and Taiwan Analyst based in Hong Kong. And today we're going to discuss cross-strait issues between China and Taiwan and other geopolitical and economic topics for Asia. So without further ado, I'm going to turn to you, Nick. So we are going to discuss China-Taiwan relations. So essentially, we've seen that this topic has made a big comeback in the news recently. What's happening there?
Right. Well, in short, we've seen an uptick in Chinese aggression towards Taiwan over the past year and a half. And this has included routine aerial incursions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone, amid other events that we call gray zone tactics, which are meant to psychologically intimidate Taiwan's population and its defenders. Importantly, this has come against the backdrop of warming Taiwanese ties with the West, particularly the US, which has all happened amid a concurrent deterioration in Western China relations. So these combined factors have prompted discussion about whether war in the Taiwan Strait is looming on the horizon. It's come amid parallel concerns building over the past few years that China's military capabilities with the US in particular are reaching certain levels of parity. And that's important because the prospect of US involvement is the biggest deterrent to a cross-strait conflict. There's a risk that China might invade Taiwan as it grows more confident in this area, but also as US-Taiwan ties become deeper. And that's a dynamic that is increasingly pushing the envelope of what China sees as crossing its red lines, although those red lines are also kept purposely vague. Nevertheless, we're still expecting China to tread cautiously here, particularly in relation to what I mentioned before regarding potential US involvement. Although the US is purposefully ambiguous in its policy towards Taiwan, the current discussion on China and Taiwan in DC right now suggests that intercession is more likely than not, particularly in a conflict scenario induced by China itself. A direct head-on clash with the US is a scenario that we don't think China is realistically ready to entertain just yet. That said, I don't want to downplay the risks here, which are numerous, and any of which could change our assumptions quite drastically.
Okay, so essentially, if we do not forecast a military conflict, what sort of forecast or what would be the biggest triggers for a conflict? Or to put it differently, what should we be looking for? What should worry us?
Right, well, the main trigger would be any development that changes the existing status quo, such as a formal declaration of Taiwanese independence or recognition of Taiwanese statehood by the US or other major Western powers. But neither of these scenarios are really that likely. Taiwan's president, Tsai Ing-wen, has maintaining the status quo as an explicit pillar of her foreign policy, while the US has long acted cautious in this regard. And that's an attitude we expected to preserve as the US foreign policy establishment returns to a more institutionalized form of US diplomacy, particularly following the chaos of the Trump years. Instead, I think the biggest risk, which could really set everything into motion, is some type of miscalculation. Each time Chinese fighter jets enter into Taiwan's ADIZ, the Taiwanese Air Force is forced to scramble in response. And each time this occurs, there's a risk of an accidental collision or even a risk of an accidental weapons discharge that could rapidly spiral into something worse. And this could essentially start a war that no one really wants. Considering all of this, I think all sides are going to continue treading very cautiously.
Okay, so listening to you, I think it's clear that a military conflict is unlikely, but then what do you think will happen in the relationship between China and Taiwan?
Well, at the political level, it's definitely going to remain very strained. So we aren't expecting a thaw in diplomatic ties anytime soon. And that's partly related to China's hostility to the current governing party in Taiwan, the Democratic Progressive Party. But it also reflects the fact that many ordinary Taiwanese are very skeptical of China as well, particularly amid all of the events that have happened recently in Hong Kong. And that's going to keep an incentive for the Taiwanese government to maintain a relatively hawkish stance towards China. Economically, however, the relationship is a lot more nuanced. China is Taiwan's biggest and most important trading partner, while Taiwan is China's most important source of semiconductors, which are integral to China's own domestic technological ambitions. Those counteracting economic dynamics will offer some stability. And China knows, for instance, that a war will be incredibly disruptive to its technology supply chains. But there'll still be many other areas of tension. For instance, the brain drain of sophisticated Taiwanese talent to China, lured by high salaries and government-backed talent attraction schemes, will and is already posing very severe risks to things like intellectual property protection, particularly among Taiwan's leading technology firms, some of which are very globally cutting edge. In the longer term, it also highlights competitive risks derived from Chinese firms who are eager to chip away at the market share currently enjoyed by many Taiwanese technology producers. In short, things are going to stay very complicated for the foreseeable future.
Thanks so much, Nick. I'm going to turn to you, Tom, now to discuss actually other issues in the Asia region from the economic and political perspective. So as we've just discussed, the cross-strait issue is a very big one. It's actually part of our top 10 risks for the global economy. But what other geopolitical risks are you monitoring in the region?
Thanks, Agathe. I mean, a lot of the risks that we're monitoring have been there for a while and certainly predate COVID. I think we've become accustomed to seeing COVID as a trend accelerator in some ways. And I think for some of those long-standing issues of contention and dispute, it has been like that. The ones that we look at most closely in the region, because of their potential economic impact, are the disputes over territory in the East China Sea between China and Japan, and in the South China Sea between China and various Southeast Asian claimants. In both those cases, I would say tensions certainly haven't reduced, and in some cases they've increased. Perhaps not to the same extent as what we've seen in Taiwan Strait, but these are still serious risks and with widespread implications for global supply chains. I think the other interesting trend in Asia is some de-intensification of risk and strains in some long-standing issues as well. India and Pakistan in recent months have moved towards reducing tensions between the two of them over the state of Kashmir. And I think the other interesting example is North Korea, which this year has shown a willingness to re-engage in diplomacy with the United States and South Korea. What's driving that is potentially a couple of different reasons. I think COVID is a factor. North Korea, for example, has been badly affected by trade blockages, which are impacting on food supply. So that may make it more interested in engagement externally. And the other one may be the Biden administration. Certainly for India, I think that's a source of pressure on the Modi government, and they will want to reduce some of the tensions and some of the points that the US government is likely to be raising with them as well. So a couple of interesting things going on there in the region, and we continue to monitor them. There are also new risks, and perhaps the most prominent one is the situation in Myanmar after the coup in February. The situation there is still uncertain and quite unstable, but certainly it's a significant risk that we could see some form of state failure and collapse, which would have quite widespread implications in Southeast Asia as borders become much more porous between Myanmar and the rest of the region. So overall, there's a mix of trends there. And I think for Asia, we're accustomed to saying Asia's economic future is very bright, but the geopolitics in the region, the number of disputed territories and the lack of regional fora to manage those disputes means that geopolitics is probably the biggest risk for the region's long-term prosperity.
That's a perfect transition to the economy and our economic forecasts for the region. So when we take a look at the data, we see that the Asia region experienced a mild recession last year compared to other regions. How is the economic recovery proceeding?
You're right. I mean, it was quite a mild recession last year compared to elsewhere. In general, pandemic management was stronger in Asia, especially East Asia, than the rest of the world. A number of economies still grew in the region last year, including China and Taiwan, for example. I would say this year's recovery has been actually perhaps a bit more bumpier than a lot of people were expecting. The big reason for that, I think, is that Asia has been relatively slow on vaccine rollout compared to global leaders in that field. In the region, vaccine rollout is still lagging the pace set in North America and in Europe, for example. And that has left economies vulnerable to the emergence of COVID-19 cases. So we've seen a number of economies have to go under forms of lockdown, reimposition of social restrictions, and so on. Most notably in South Asia and India, which suffered a terrible second wave, which is now past its peak, but also in Southeast Asia, which didn't really have much of a significant COVID wave last year, but currently is in the midst of quite a significant one. The slow pace of vaccination means that these forms of on-off restrictions are going to be with us into next year, I would imagine, by when we'll see wider mass vaccination take place in the region. But it's certainly been a bumpier ride than we perhaps were expecting, with some notable exceptions. I think China's still growing quite strongly. Taiwan is also growing strongly this year. So there are some exceptions to the trend, but in general, slow vaccination has cast a break on the pace of recovery this year in Asia. Overall, partly because of base effects, Asian GDP fell by about 1.5 percentage points last year. This year, we're going to see growth of around 6% in the region as a whole. But those base effects do mask some weakness, I think, in the sequential numbers, certainly.
And actually, to dig a bit deeper, which economies do you think will perform the strongest over the next 12 months? So we finish on a positive note.
I think there's a lot of volatility in the numbers, right, because of the base effects. I mean, if we were just looking at our 21 forecast for Asia, India would stand out as the strongest growing major economy in the region. We have it growing at above 10% this year as it recovers from that second wave and moves away from social restrictions. But I think in terms of actual economic performance, I would be encouraging businesses and companies to look for economies which are performing more consistently in terms of economic growth and activity, and have showing the best ability to manage the pandemic when it's arisen. So I think, to go back to the examples we talked a bit about already, China and Taiwan certainly stand out this year as economies which grew last year and are continuing to grow strongly this year and into 22. I think other good examples in the region include the likes of Korea and Australia, which again have managed the pandemic relatively well and are continuing to see strong export performance too. Yeah, in general, I think look out for consistency and look out for pandemic management as being the key elements in terms of building exposure to certain economies in the region this year.
Thanks so much, Tom, and thanks so much, Nick. We're at the end of the video now. You can always find our latest analysis on our website, www.eiu.com. Keep an eye on our latest forecasts and white papers. We have great white papers, for instance, on the impact of the pandemic on global supply chains or on vaccination timelines. You can also follow us on Twitter at the EIU or on our personal Twitters, and hopefully our handles should show nicely on your screen. Thanks for joining us today and see you next month. Thank you. Goodbye.